had been alone in space for 3 years now. His South ship, the Quiet Dawn, was small and old, but it was home. He took jobs that other pilots refused. He flew into dangerous places and pulled out valuable scraps from dead stations and broken ships. It kept him busy, and that was all he wanted. But it meant he did not have to think about his wife and how she had died from a sickness that no doctor could cure. It meant he did not have to feel the empty space beside him when he slept. He was scanning an abandoned alien station in a system far from Earth. The station belonged to the species known throughout the galaxy for their cold logic and complete lack of emotion. They had left the place decades ago, and nobody knew why. Jack did not care about the reason. He only cared about the car wiring and the power cells that might still be inside. Scanner beeped and he looked at the screen. There were plenty of materials worth taking, good metals and some intact machinery, but then the scanner beeped again in a different tone. Jack frowned and adjusted the settings. The screen showed something that made no sense. A life sign. Something was alive inside that did station. Call was clear in ways like this. He should report the reading to the nearest authority and leave the area. Let someone else deal with it. Jack stared at the blinking dot on his screen for a long moment. The life sign was weak and getting weaker. Whatever was in there would not survive much longer. He told himself it was probably just an animal, some creature that had wandered in and got trapped. But his hands were already guiding the ship toward the station docking port. His heart was beating faster and he did not know why. Something was pulling him forward. Something he could not explain. The station was dark and cold. Jack walked through empty hallways with only his flashlight to show the way. Frost covered the walls and his breath came out in white clouds. The power had failed long ago and the temperature had dropped to dangerous levels. Nothing should be alive in here. Followed the signal deeper into the station, past empty rooms and silent quarters, past strange alien symbols that he could not read. The signal grew stronger as he walked and then it began to fade. Whoever was in here was dying. Jack moved faster. Found it in a small room at the center of the station. A pod sat on a metal table. It was made of clear material and Jack could see inside. His flashlight revealed a small form curled up at the bottom. A baby. An alien baby with pale blue skin and 4 fingers on each tiny hand. Its eyes were closed and it was not moving. Had seen before. Tall and thin with faces that never showed feeling. They spoke in flat tones and looked at other species like they were studying insects. The idea of a baby had never crossed his mind. He had assumed they grew in tubes or were built in factories, but here was proof that they were born just like human. The pod was cold to the touch. Jack searched for a way to open it and found a small panel on the side. He pressed it and the top slid open with a soft hiss. The baby did not react. Jack reached in carefully and touched its arm. The skin was ice cold, but he could feel a faint pulse beneath it. The baby opened its eyes. Had expected the same empty stare that a doll had, but these eyes were different. They were large and dark and filled with something that looked like fear. The baby looked at him and made a sound. Not a cry exactly. Something softer and more disparate. A whisper that seemed to bypass his translator device and go straight into his chest. Help me? Words were not real. The babe could not speak, but Jack heard them anyway. He heard them in the way the tiny hand reached toward him. He heard them in the way those dark eyes begged him not to leave. The station groaned around him. Metal twisted somewhere in the distance and the floor shook beneath his feet. The structure was failing. Without power to maintain it, the whole thing was falling apart. He had minced at most before it collapsed completely. He looked at the baby. He looked at the door. He thought about all the rules he would break if he took this child. He thought about the questions and the problems and the danger. Then he thought about walking away and leaving this tiny creature to die alone in the cold and the dark. Picked up the baby and held it against his chest. The small body was so light it barely weighed anything. Jack wrapped his jacket around the child and started running. The station shook harder now. Pieces of the ceiling fell behind him as he ran. He could hear the metal screaming as it tore itself apart. The docking port was ahead and his ship was waiting. He pushed through the airlock just as the corridor behind him collapsed into nothing. He sealed the door and fell against the wall. His heart was pounding and his lungs burned from the cold air he had been breathing. But the baby in his arms was still alive, still looking at him with those eyes that held more feeling than any was supposed to have. The child to the cockpit and sat down in his chair. The station was breaking apart outside his window. Great pieces of metal spinning off into space. In a few minutes there would be nothing left. No evidence that anyone had ever been there. No record of a baby abandoned to die. Jack had the evidence now. He had the child in his arms and he had no idea what to do next. The baby made that soft sound again and Jack looked down. Those dark eyes were still watching him, still trusting him, still hopping. He spent 3 years running from his feelings. 3 years filling his days with work so he would not have to face the emptiness inside him. But something had changed in that moment. Something had cracked open in his chest when he heard the tiny whisper in the dark. The baby was shivering. Its temperature was dropping and Jack had no idea how to care for an alien infant. He did not know what it ate or how warm it needed to be or if it could even survive outside the pod. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He was not going to let this child die. He set course for the nearest outpost and pushed the engines to full power. Help was 2 days away. He just had to keep the baby alive until then. He had no idea if he could do it, but he was going to try. For the first time in 3 years, Jack had something to fight for. It was dying and Jack did not know how to stop it. He had placed the child on his bunk and covered it with every blanket he owned, but the small body kept getting colder. The pale blue skin was turning gray at the edges and the breathing was becoming shallow. Jack watched the tiny chest rise and fall and felt completely helpless. Searched his ship metal database for information on biology. The results were almost useless. Adult required a sick temperature range and certain nutrients, but there was nothing about infant. They kept their reproductive practices secret from other species. Nobody outside their civilization knew how they raised their young. Except beside the baby and tried to think. He was 2 days from the nearest outpost. 2 days was too long. The child would not survive that long without proper care. He needed help now and there was only one person he could think of who might be able to give it. Went to the communication console and entered a frequency he had not used in over a year. The signal would take time to reach its destination, but he had no other choice. He recorded his message and sent it out into the void. Then he went back to watch over the baby and pray that someone would answer. Hours later the console beeped. Jack rushed to it and saw a face appear on the screen. Doctor looked older than he remembered. Her dark hair had more gray in it now and there were lines around her eyes that had not been there before. But her voice was the same, warm and steady and full of concern. Asked him what was wrong and Jack told her everything. The abandoned station, the dying baby, his desperate need for guidance. Listened without interrupting. When he finished she was quiet for a long moment. Then she started giving instruction. He needed warmth but not too much warmth. Infants could not regulate their own temperature, so the environment had to do it for them. Told Jack to set his cabin to exactly 18 degrees and to wrap the child in a single thin blanket instead of the pile he had used. Too much insulation would trap cold instead of letting the body warm naturally. Came the question of food. Jack had nothing suitable on his ship but talked him through a solution. Infants could absorb nutrients through their skin in the early stage of life. Jack had a metal kit with basic supplements. Told him what ones to mix together and how to apply the paste to the baby's arms and chest. Followed every instruction carefully. He adjusted the temperature. He removed the extra blankets. He mixed the supplement paste and spread it gently on the baby's skin. The child whimpered at his touch but did not pull away. Those dark eyes watched him with something that looked like trust. Past and the gray color began to fade from the baby's skin. The breathing grew stronger. Jack sat beside the child and felt tears running down his face. He had not cried since his wife's funeral. He had locked all his feelings away in a box deep inside himself. But now that box was breaking open and he could not stop the flood. Found himself talking to the baby, telling it about his wife and how much he had loved her, telling it about the farm they had planned to buy when they retired, telling it about all the dreams that had died when she did. The baby could not understand his words, but it seemed to respond to his voice. It turned toward him and made soft sounds whenever he spoke. Decided the baby needed a name. He could not keep calling it the baby or the child. He thought about it for a while and then remembered the soft sound that had pulled him into the station, the whisper that had seemed to echo in his mind. Echo. He would call the baby Echo. Was feeding Echo more supplement paste when the communicating console beeped again. Jack expected to see his face, but instead he saw something that made his blood turn cold. Officer stared at him from the screen. Her face was perfectly smooth and her eyes showed nothing at all. Introduced herself as Officer Tail Eyes of the Enforcement Division. She said that Jack had been detected at the abandoned station. She said that he had taken something that belonged to the people. She said that he would surrender it immediately. Asked what she meant, and Tail Eyes answered without emotion. The defective specimen, the infant that had been left for disposal. Jack had interfered with the field protocol. He had committed a crime against their civilization. He would return the specimen at once so that proper termination procedures could be completed. Felt his hands begin to shake, not from fear but from anger. He looked at Echo sleeping peacefully on the bunk. He looked at the small blue face that had shown him more feeling in one day than he had felt in 3 years. Then he looked back at the screen and told Officer Tail Eyes that she could go to hell. Eyes did not react to his words. She simply stated that he had made an unfortunate choice. Warships were already on their way to his location. They would arrive in 6 hours. If he did not surrender the specimen willingly, they would take it by force. There would be consequences for his interference. The screen went dark. Jack sat in silence for a long moment. His old life would have been simple. Turn over the baby and walk away. Pretend it never happened. Go back to his empty existence among the stars. But that life was over now. It had ended the moment he heard the tiny whisper in the dark. He sent another message told her what was happening, told her he needed help. Then he picked up Echo and held the babe close to his chest. The child made a soft sound and knelt against him, so small and so helpless and so completely dependent on him. 6 hours until they arrived. 6 hours to figure out how to save this tiny life from the people who wanted to end it. Jack did not have a plan yet, but he knew one thing for certain. He would die before he let anyone hurt this child. Bond came quickly. She was already on her way. Her research vessel was faster than his south ship. She would reach him in 5 hours with the proper nutrients Echo needed, and she was not coming alone. She had called in favors from people she knew, people who might be willing to stand against them. Felt hope flicker in his chest. It was a small flame, but it was there. He was not alone anymore. He had a friend coming to help him. He had a child to protect. He had a reason to keep fighting. He looked down at Echo and made a promise. Whatever happened next, he would not let the baby die. Not today. Not ever. This child deserved a chance to live, a chance to grow, a chance to become something more than a defective specimen marked for disposal. Jack had found his purpose again, and he was not going to let it go. Tail Eyes appeared on the screen again, and this time Jack was ready for her. He had spent the last hour preparing himself for the conversation. He had fed Echo and made sure the baby was comfortable. Now he stood in front of the console with his arms crossed and his jaw set firm. I spoke first. She said the warship was closing in. She said there was still time for Jack to make the logical choice. She said he was risking his life for something that had no value. Jack asked her to explain what she meant, and Tail Eyes answered without any hesitation. The infant he had taken was defective. It had been born with a genetic error that caused it to experience emotions. Under this was considered the worst possible flaw. Emotions clouded judgment. Emotions led to poor decisions. Emotions made a person weak and unreliable. Any born with this defect was removed from society before it could contaminate others. He listened to her words and felt sick to his stomach. He asked if she was saying they killed bobbies for having feelings. Tail Eyes corrected him. They did not kill them. They simply allowed nature to take its course. The defective specimens were placed in isolated locations and left to fade away peacefully. It was humane and efficient. Told her there was nothing humane about abandoning a baby to die alone in the cold. He told her that emotions were not a disease. He told her that the capacity to feel was what made life worth living. Tail Eyes stared at him with empty eyes and said she did not expect a human to understand. Humans were ruled by their emotions. That was why they would always be inferior. Conversation ended when ship appeared on Jack's sensors. The small research veil dropped out of faster-than-light travel and immediately moved to join him. His face replaced Tail Eyes on the screen and she was smiling. She had brought the nutrients Echo needed. She had brought medical equipment. And she had brought news. Warship was not the only vessel tracking Jack's location. It spread the word about what was happening through channels she trusted. Other ships were on their way, not to attack but to witness. They did their dirty work in secret. They would not want an audience for what they planned to do. With Jack's shipment came aboard carrying supplies. She went straight to Echo and began a proper examination while Jack watched nervously. The baby responded well to her touch, said the child was stronger than expected. The makeshift care Jack had provided had saved Echo's life. Now with proper treatment, the baby would recover fully. Felt relief wash over him, but there was no time to celebrate. The warship appeared on his sensors just as finished her examination. It was huge compared to their small vessel, a military cruiser bristling with weapons. It moved toward them slowly and deliberately, a predator approaching its prey. Liz contacted them again. She demanded they surrender the specimen immediately. She said they were interfering with internal matters. She said there would be serious consequences if they did not comply. Jack looked at and looked at Jack. Neither of them moved. Did something unexpected. She opened a broadcast channel to every ship within range. She identified herself as doctor of the Human Research Initiative. She explained the situation clearly and simply. A baby had been abandoned to die because it could feel emotion. 2 humans were trying to save it, but wanted to take the child and kill it. Response was immediate. A Mertonville changed course to intercept them. An explorer ship did the same. Then a human military patrol announced they were moving to investigate. Within minutes, a dozen ships were heading toward their location, all of them demanding to know what was happening. Liz ordered Jack to close the broadcast. Jack refused. More ships arrived. Some came out of curiosity. Others came out of outrage. The gathered fleet was small, but it represented species from across the galaxy, and they were all watching. Warship stopped moving. Tail Eyes appeared on screen again, and this time there was something different in her expression. Not emotion exactly, but something close to uncertainty. She had expected to handle it quietly. She had expected the humans to be alone and helpless. She had not expected witnesses. Spoke directly to the gathered ships. He held Echo up so the cameras could see the baby. He showed them the small blue face and the dark eyes and the tiny hands reaching for comfort. He told them this child had been sentenced to death for the crime of having feelings. He asked them if that was justice. Captain responded first. Her species valued family above all else. She said what they did to their children was an abomination. They agreed. They were an emotional species who celebrated art and music and love. The idea of killing a baby for feeling fear or joy horrified them. Voices joined the chorus. Species that rarely agreed on anything found common ground in their disgust. Practiced something monstrous and they had kept it hidden for centuries. Now the galaxy knew the truth. More ships arrived. Jack felt his heart sink as he watched them take position around the warship. They were outnumbered now. The alien vessels that had come to witness could not stand against military force. Elias did not give the order to attack. She stood on her bridge and watched the gathered fleet and calculated the costs. If she destroyed these ships, the galaxy would unite against her people. They survived through trade and treaties. They could not afford to become outcasts. Began a cry, a real cry this time, full of fear and confusion. Jack held the babe close and whispered soft words of comfort. The crying faded to whimpers and then to silence. The child trusted him completely, believed he would keep it safe no matter what happened. Looked at the ship surrounding them and made a decision. He would not run. He would not hide. He would stand here with this child in his arms and force the galaxy to choose a side. Either they believed that all life had value or they did not. There was no middle ground. And off continued as more ships arrived. The situation was changing with every passing minute. What had started as a simple retrieval mission was becoming something much bigger. Jack did not know how it would end, but he knew he had started something that could not be stopped. Looked up at him with those dark eyes and made a soft sound. Jack smiled down at the baby and felt something warm spread through his chest. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. A broken human and an abandoned alien child against an empire that had forgotten how to feel. It should have been hopeless, but somehow it felt like the beginning of something wonderful. And off had lagged for 12 hours now. Ships from a dozen species floated in space between Jack's small vessel and the warships. Nobody had fired a weapon. Nobody had retreated. The galaxy was holding its breath and waiting to see what would happen next. Stood at his console with Echo sleeping in a carrier strapped to his chest. The baby had finally calmed down after hours of restless crying, was monitoring the child's vital signs from her ship. Everything looked stable for now, but they could not stay here forever. Something had to change. Change came in the form of a human diplomatic vessel that dropped out of faster than light traveled directly between the two sides. It was a large ship with the emblem of the Earth Alliance painted on its hull. Jack recognized the design. This was a ship meant for negotiation, not combat. Someone important had decided to get involved. His face appeared on every screen in the fleet. She introduced herself as Ambassador Grace of the Earth Alliance. She spoke calmly and clearly. She said she was here to resolve this situation peacefully. She requested that all parties stand down while she facilitated discussion. Tail Eyes agreed to talk. She had no other choice really. Attacking a diplomatic vessel would be an act of war against humanity. They were powerful, but they could not fight the entire galaxy alone. Negotiation was their only option now. It happened over video channels so everyone could watch. Grace began by asking Tail Eyes to explain the position. Tail Eyes described their practices without shame or apology. Defective weapons were removed for the good of society. Emotional instability was a threat to their civilization. This had been their way for thousands of years. They saw no reason to change. Just listened without interrupting. When Tail Eyes finished, the ambassador turned to address the gathered fleet. She asked representatives from other species to share their thoughts. One by one they spoke. They talked about the sacred bond between parent and child. They described how emotion drove their greatest achievements in art and science. The humans spoke about compassion and mercy and the belief that every life had worth. Eyes dismissed their words as sentiment. She said they had built a perfect society by eliminating weakness. Their people did not suffer from war or crime or conflict. They lived in harmony because they had removed the chaos that emotion created. Other species might find their methods distasteful, but the results spoke for themselves. He asked a simple question. If the way was so perfect, then why did they hide it from the galaxy? Why did they abandon their unwanted children in secret instead of announcing their practices openly? Tail Eyes had no answer for that. Batter pressed harder. She said they were ashamed of what they did. They knew deep down that killing babies was wrong. That was why they did it in the shadows where nobody could see. But the shadows were gone now. The whole galaxy was watching. They had to face what they had become. Watched the negotiation and felt hope growing in his chest. Grace was doing what he could never have done. She was using words instead of weapons. She was forcing them to confront the truth about themselves. And it was working. Eyes consulted with her superiors through a private channel. The discussion took several hours. Jack used the time to care for Echo. He fed the baby and changed the cloth that served as diaper. He sang soft songs that his wife used to love, watched through the video link and smiled at him with tears in her eyes. Tail Eyes returned with an answer. The High Council had reached a decision. They would not pursue the defective specimen any further. The child called Echo would be allowed to remain with the humans. This was a one-time exception made to preserve diplomatic relations. It did not represent any change in policy. She accepted the compromise, but she was not finished. She said the galaxy would be watching them from now on. Any further evidence of infanticide would result in severe consequences. Trade sanction, diplomatic isolation, complete exclusion from galactic affairs. They could keep their practices if they wished, but they would pay a heavy price. She began to withdraw. Tail Eyes appeared on screen one last time to address Jack directly. She told him he had made powerful enemies today. She told him they did not forget those who interfered with their affairs. She told him to enjoy his victory while it lasted. Looked at Echo sleeping peacefully against his chest. He looked at the fleet of ships that had gathered to protect one small life. He looked at Grace, who had faced down an empire with nothing but words. Then he looked back at Tail Eyes and smiled. Told her she was right. He had made enemies today, but he had also made friends. And he had saved a life that they had thrown away like garbage. He said he would take the trade-in day of the week. Screen went dark, they were gone. Jack sank into his chair and let out a breath he had been holding for what felt like years. It was over. Echo was safe. They had won. Board his ship and wrapped her arms around him. She was crying and laughing at the same time. Jack held her with one arm while keeping Echo secure with the other. For a moment, they just stood there together, three souls who had found each other in the vast emptiness of space. He contacted them before her ship departed. She said Jack had done something remarkable today. He had forced the galaxy to look at something ugly and decide that it was wrong. Change would not happen overnight, but it would happen. Seeds had been planted that would grow into something better. Thanked her but said he had not done anything special. He had just refused to let a baby die. Any decent person would have done the same. Gray smiled and said that was exactly what made it special. Most people talked about doing the right thing. Jack had actually done it. Fleet dispersed slowly, ships returning to their normal routes and missions, but something had changed in the way they looked at each other. Species that had been strangers were now connected by a shared experience. They had stood together against cruelty. That bond would not be easily broken. Set course for the nearest human colony. He had decisions to make about his future and Echo's future, but those could wait. Right now he just wanted to get somewhere safe, somewhere he could rest, somewhere he could begin building a new life with the child he had saved. Now, she was coming with them. She had research to complete and a baby to monitor. Besides, she said someone needed to make sure Jack did not mess it up. Jack laughed for the first time in years, a real laugh that came from somewhere deep inside. Woke up and looked at both of them with those dark, curious eyes. The baby made a soft sound that might have been happiness. Jack held the child close and whispered a promise. They were going to be okay, all of them, together. Stars stretched out before them as they flew toward home. Months had passed since Jack brought Echo home to the colony world of New Haven. The planet was green and peaceful with rolling hills and wide open seas. Jack had bought a small house on the edge of a farming community. It had a porch where he could sit and watch the sunset. It had a room that he had painted soft blue for Echo. It had everything he needed to start over. Settled nearby in a cottage that served as both home and laboratory. She came by every day to check on Echo and run nests. The baby was growing fast, stronger every week. The pale blue skin had taken on a healthier shade, and those dark eyes sparkled with curiosity about everything. Echo was thriving in ways that should have been impossible for a child. Had learned how to be a father. It had not been easy at first. He had made mistakes, fed Echo too much or too little, panicked over normal baby sounds, stayed awake for days because he was afraid something would go wrong. But slowly he had found his rhythm. He learned what Echo liked and did not like. He learned to read the sounds and expressions that told him what the baby needed. Colonists had accepted them without question. Humans were good at that, taking in strays and making them family. Some of the neighbors brought food and offered advice. Others just smiled and waved when Jack walked by with Echo in his arms. Nobody treated the alien baby as strange or wrong. They saw a child and a father, and that was enough. One morning with news that changed everything. Her research had finally produced results. She had been studying Echo's genetics for months, comparing them to normal samples, looking for the source of the so-called defect that had caused the baby to be abandoned. What she found was not a defect at all. It represented an evolutionary leap for the species. The genes that allowed emotional experience were not errors. They were advancements. They enabled bonding and empathy and cooperation, traits that made species stronger, not weaker. They had been suppressing these developments for thousands of years, killing the children who showed them, preventing their own evolution out of fear. Listened to explain her findings and felt anger rising in his chest. All those bobbies abandoned over the centuries. All those potential lives snuffed out before they could begin. They had been destroying their own future because they were afraid of change. It was the most tragic thing he had ever heard. There was more. Echo was not just emotional. The baby showed signs of abilities that no had ever displayed. A sensitivity to the feelings of others. An awareness that went beyond normal perception. Echo could sense when Jack was sad or happy or worried. The baby responded to emotion in ways that suggested something close to telepathy. That's why they really wanted Echo dead. Not because of the emotion, but because of what those emotions enabled. Or with these abilities could read others, could understand them, could connect with them in ways the cold, locked society could never control. Echo was a threat to everything they had built. Looked at the babe playing on the floor with soft toys. Echo grabbed a stuffed animal and laughed. Such a simple sound, but it meant everything. This child was proof that they could be more than they were, could feel and love and grow, and someone had tried to throw that proof away like trash. Message arrived later that day. A small ship had entered the system and requested permission to land. Jack's first instinct was to refuse, a call for help, to protect Echo from whatever new threat was coming. But the message said they came in peace, said they wanted to talk, said they had questions that only he could answer. Young arrived at his door the next morning. They were nervous in a way that adult never showed. Their eyes darted around and their hands fidgeted at their sides. They introduced themselves as researchers from a university on them. They had heard about Echo. They wanted to learn. Invited them inside warily. He kept Echo close as they talked. The young explained that they belonged to a growing movement among their people, a movement that questioned the old ways. They had studied ancient texts and found evidence that they had not always been emotionless. Something had changed thousands of years ago. A decision had been made to suppress feelings. They wanted to understand why. Them and shared her research. She showed the young what Echo's genetics revealed, showed them that emotional capacity was evolution, not corruption, showed them that their society had been crippling itself for. The researchers listened with expressions that almost looked like wonder. Asked to see Echo. Jack hesitated, but something told him it was safe. He set the baby on the floor and watched as the young knelt down to look. Echo reached up and touched one of their faces. The flinched but did not pull away. Tears began to fall from eyes that had never cried before. Search said he felt something warm and strange and overwhelming. He did not have words for it. His companions were crying too now, all of them experiencing emotions for the first time in their lives. Echo had somehow unlocked something inside them, shown them what they had been missing. Watched the scene unfold and understood what was happening. Echo was not just a survivor. The baby was a key, a bridge between what they were and what they could become. The moment in his living room was the beginning of something that would change an entire civilization. Stayed for a week. They learned everything Jack could teach them about emotions, how to recognize them, how to express them, how to live with the chaos and beauty they brought. When they left, they carried that knowledge back to their people, seeds planted in fertile ground. A council sent a final message. They announced that they would not change their policies. They would continue their practices as they always had, but they could not stop the question spreading among their young, could not silence the doubts growing in hearts that had never felt doubt before. Sat on his porch and watched the sun set over New Haven. Echo toddled across the wooden boards on unsteady legs. The baby had learned to walk just last week. Every day brought new milestone, new proof that this child was going to be something extraordinary. reached Jack and wrapped small blue arms around his leg. The baby looked up at him and smiled. Then came a sound that made Jack's heart stop, a word spoken clearly for the first time, not in but in English, the language Echo had heard every day since being rescued. Abba picked up the child and held Echo tight against his chest. Tears streamed down his face as he looked at those dark eyes that held so much love. He thought about his wife and how much she would have adored them all. He thought about the empty years after she died and how meaningless they had seemed. He thought about a tiny whisper in the dark that had changed everything. Stars were coming out now. Somewhere among them, a ridged society was beginning to crack. Young were asking questions their elders could not answer. Change was coming slowly, but it was coming. And it had all started with one human who heard a babe cry and refused to walk away. Jack held his child and watched the night sky fill with light. He was not alone anymore. He had a family again. He had a purpose again. He had love again. Somewhere out there, a whole species was learning what those things meant for the very first time.